It's a real honor to speak in the very town that Calder called home for so many years. Prior to moving here in 1933, Calder had lived and worked in a number of small spaces in Paris and New York. So when he moved here and he stood amidst the open landscape on his newly purchased property, he found a new scale in his work, both in size and in sensibility. In the summer of 1934, Calder made his first works for the outdoors, and he called these things for the open air. And behind me is Calder assembling one of them called Steelfish. Calder likened these works to sailing vessels, and he said that they react best to one kind of breeze. Later, the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre visited Calder's studio in Roxbury, and he offered somewhat of a more amorphous interpretation of the subtle shift in Calder's work. And I'm going to read a little excerpt. You can find the full text on our website. It's an amazing text. But Sartre wrote, "In the past, Calder drove his mobiles with an electric motor. Now he abandons them in the wild. In a garden, by an open window, he lets them vibrate in the wind like aeolian harps. They feed on the air, breathe it, and take their life from the indistinct life of the atmosphere. Their mobility is, then, of a very particular kind." And that's a beautiful text, and one of the many things that I love about this text is that while it underscores, Sartre underscores the strong influence of the natural world on Calder's work, he recognizes this relationship as an extremely complex, dignified, and non-imitative one. And Calder himself early on, in 1932, wrote about his works not as extractions, but as abstractions that are like nothing else in life. So since today's talk is organized around a large-scale abstract work at the Minor Memorial Library, I'd like to talk about these early outdoor works and how they were really the beginning of this progression towards the monumental in Calder's work. And in the interest of time, I'm going to just loosely highlight this progression because I'd like to show you some really great archival photographs of the Roxbury property in the 30s and in the 40s, and talk a little bit about what was going on in Calder's life then. But before we get to Roxbury, I think it's really important just to establish some of the groundbreaking works that Calder was doing in Paris right before he moved to Roxbury, and just so you can get a sense of his attitude for sculpture. So here's a photograph of Calder in Paris in the fall of 1931. He's in his fourth and last studio there. And this photo really marks a great moment in his life. He's a young artist, 33 years old. He's really courageous out there, allowing himself to be seen. He had just gotten married to Louisa James about 8 or so months earlier. And Louisa James was the grandniece of Henry James and William James. And he had met her in 1929 on a steamship crossing the Atlantic, on one of his many steamship crossings during his Paris years. Also, just months before this photo was taken, you'll notice all these works bundled around him. He had just had a really radical show at the Gallery Percier in Paris, where he premiered all of his first abstract works, and so many of them are bundled around him. And Fernand Léger, the painter, wrote the preface for the exhibition catalog. And in it, he ranked Calder among what he described as the unchallenged masters of unexpressed and silent beauty: Satie, Mondrian, Duchamp, Brancusi, and art. Calder is in the same family. So it's really amazing. Just 5 years after moving to Paris, and less than 10 after deciding to become an artist in the first place, Calder was already considered among these heavyweights of the Parisian vanguard. And here's an installation of the exhibition I just talked about at Gallery Percier in Paris. And the title of this show is Volumes, Vectors, Densities, Dessins, and Portraits. And it's important to remember that it was with these terms that Calder used to describe his early abstract work. You'll see installed along the top of the wall are his wire portraits. He began doing these in Paris in the mid-1920s. And they're all of, various personalities, Léger, Edgar Varese, Kiki de Montparnasse. And it's difficult to imagine now, but these sculptures, he didn't even call them sculptures, he called them objects. They completely fell outside the realm of what was considered art. They were transparent volumes in space without mass. And he had these wonderful trembling wire lines, and everybody was really, they were just a complete radical shift in sculpture. There's a great article from 1929 in which the critic writes that Calder's eye has ennobled the metal wire. He describes the sculpture as immaterial sculpture, renouncing all inflation and eager synthesis. I love that description of it. Ranged on the planks against the wall are abstract works that Calder began creating around 1930 after visiting Piet Mondrian's studio in October of 1930. So these were his first abstract works. Beforehand, he was doing more figurative works like the wire sculptures that you see, the wire portraits. And then after this visit, he was shocked into abstraction. And it wasn't necessarily Mondrian's paintings, but it was really the studio environment and the actuation of space that inspired Calder. And art would later call these abstract works stabiles. And you'll notice there's pronounced use of spheres and discs and circles, and these are what Calder called universal forms that he defined in variations. And he later wrote that his whole theory on art was the disparity that exists between these forms, masses, and movements. And here is one of Calder's first motorized objects from 1931. And it was this very work that prompted Marcel Duchamp to coin the term mobile in 1931. He had visited Calder in his studio that we just saw, the one in the fall of 1931. And as you can see, it's much different from what we think of as a mobile today. It uses motors, and it was all about the orbits and speeds and accelerations and all of these ideas. And in French, mobile means both motion and motive, and both Calder and Duchamp enjoyed this pun. This is also one of Calder's first motorized panel works from 1931. It's called Two Spheres. It's made with a panel from a door and a store-bought motor that sets the spheres in motion. And this fundamentally poetic approach to everyday materials was something that was really an important part of Calder's creative process throughout his career. Of this work, Calder said, "This has no utility and no meaning. It is simply beautiful. It has a great emotional effect if you understand it. Of course, if it meant anything, it would be easier to understand, but it would not be worthwhile." So Calder, with this work, he's really challenging the viewer in 1931 and even today to step away from all of our preconceptions and experiences and try to understand how something that has no meaning can be emotional. And I've certainly experienced that with several mobiles that just are so beautiful they can move me to tears in a way. So here are two early hanging mobiles. The one on the left is from Paris in 1933. It's called Cône de Ben, and it's made of solid ebony and at a 9-foot drop. It's a really large work and lumbering work. It gives evidence of Calder's desire to create on a monumental scale. And on the right is Starfish from 1934. The work on the right was created in Roxbury. So it's interesting to look at these two works comparatively, whereas the one on the left is more lumbering and heavy. It's very coarse and it requires a lot of effort for movement. The one on the right, Starfish, is lighter and much more refined. So the one on the left, Cône de Ben, was probably one of the last works that Calder made in Paris before he moved to America with his wife Louisa. It was shown in an exhibition in June of 1933, and they came over here in July of 1933. So just for a little backstory, Calder and Louisa returned to America in part due to the war preparations in Europe and also in the hopes of starting a family. Upon arriving, they immediately visited Louisa's parents in Concord, Massachusetts. They bought a 1930 LaSalle touring car, and they set out to find a farmhouse in the country with a possible studio conversion. They searched unsuccessfully along the Housatonic River in Massachusetts, and New York and Long Island, and then finally they came to Connecticut, where they lived in Westport and also in Sandy Hook. And in August of 1933, they visited a real estate agent in Danbury who showed them this property in Roxbury. And they were both immediately taken with this property. You can see in this photo Calder in the doorway. with saw and shovel, ready to start working on his new fixer-upper. They bought this 18th century colonial, the burned out dairy barn, and 18 acres for $3,500 from the estate of Charles Hurd. And as you can see, the house needed everything from interior plumbing to paint, plaster, windows. And not being a rich man, Calder had to attend to much of these renovations himself, and he also writes about finding a quote-unquote strange crew of locals from the area to help him with these renovations. His plumber was claimed to be an expert just from reading Popular Mechanics magazines, and that didn't work out too well for him. He had to work on the plumbing again later. And he actually was so strapped for money at the time that he couldn't even afford the down payment. He had to enlist his friend from college, Bill Drew, to front the 10% down payment for the house. And so during early renovations, Calder stayed with a sculptor friend in New Milford, Jose de Kraft, and he was one of quite a few art world folk that lived in the area, many of whom Calder knew. There was also Bob Josevi, who is a book designer and a fruit grower. He lived in Westport, and Calder had been to visit him before coming to Roxbury. And Josevi actually started Blue Jay Orchards, which is in Bethel today. And Peter Bloom, who is one of Calder's oldest friends from the Art Students League, he's a painter. He lived in Sherman. Calder actually didn't know that he lived around here when he first moved here, but he heard about him and sought him out. And then Peter Bloom introduced him to Malcolm Cowley, who also lived in Sherman, and Calder immediately hung out with these boys from Sherman, as he called them. They immediately became close. And it wasn't long before Calder formed close ties with all of the progressive people at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, including A. Everett Chick Austin, who was the director at the time, and also James Thrall-Sobey, who was an advisor. And they really supported Calder and promoted his work in those early days. And actually the Wadsworth bought one of Calder's, one of his early panel works. It was one of the first Calders to enter to a museum, and they bought it for $75 in 1935. So this is the ice house in the back of the house. This is how it looked when they bought the property in the summer of 1933. Actually, this was in September of 1933. They signed the mortgage September 1st. Calder converted this into the first studio that he had ever owned. He bought used windows, he nailed it into place, and he brought in large stumps on which he could sit and work. And later on, when he built a new studio, which I'll show you, he converted this space into a living room. So Calder didn't create much work that first year, but by 1934 he was in the Ice House studio making artworks. Here he is with the ballet object. This is a continuation of a project he began in Paris a year prior. And as you can see, this particular object is defined by this, or is constructed of this transparent cube that defines a space for action, and it harkens back to this idea of volumes, vectors, and densities. And the idea was to enlarge these projects into a full-size proscenium scale, making mobile decor or performance objects for a theatrical space, and Calder did do that. Early collaborators was the choreographer Martha Graham in 1935, and also the composer Virgil Thompson in 1936 for a performance at the Wadsworth. Here's an interior view of his Ice House studio in 1934. You can see there's earthen floors, makes it seem just very primitive, and this wonderful abstract object on top of this big stump. And in the upper right, you'll see these panels and frames. Calder worked prolifically on these works that were panels and frames up until about 1936. They're sort of a progression of the work I showed you earlier, two spheres with the motor. And in the upper right corner up here, you can see one with a frame and a spiral helix in it. Yeah. And this is the final work. It's called Black Frame. This is a motorized work, and this was actually included in Calder's first exhibition with the legendary dealer Pierre Matisse, who is the son of Henri Matisse. He had a gallery in the Fuller Building in New York. And Calder proposed this first show, and he ended up showing with Matisse for the next 9 years. This is really a huge deal because Matisse was only showing European artists at the time, so to throw this young American artist into the mix must have really created somewhat of a provocative dialogue. And here is black frame. You can see the frozen and in motion. Calder called these moving elements brilliant spots in an otherwise somber setting. So you can see the disc moves back and forth, the helix turns, and the red sphere moves. So if you've noticed up until this point, many of the works I've shown you have incorporated movement by means of motorization, cranks, and there were also quite a few that called for viewer intervention. Also, the configuration of the moving objects is often defined to a portion of space within box-like frames or in front of panels. In front, he did a number of works where there are these, broad circles with hanging mobiles. So it was really a critical moment when, in the summer of 1934, the weather permitting, he turned away from the studio and he looked to the open fields and he made his first wind-propelled works inspired by the landscape. So we went from these works to these works. These are the first two works that Calder made for the open air. To the left is a work called Red and Yellow Vein. It's nearly 6 feet tall, has a relatively simple movement. And you can see these variations on the color. And to the right is an untitled sister sculpture, about 9 feet tall, and it's a bit more complex. And these works have these iron rod legs in a tripod form so that Calder could stick it in the soil and anchor them in the ground. But as you can see, these are relatively delicate for outdoor works. So he was experimenting at this time, and so these were easily damaged in the wind. So Calder made a third work that summer, Steelfish. And this is actually the one that we saw in the introduction slide that he was assembling. This work was much stronger. It was constructed of welded steel rods of a larger gauge so that it could withstand the elements. It's about 10 feet tall, 11 feet wide. And with these early open-air works, it's important to remember that Calder's process was incredibly intuitive and direct. So to engage the immediacy of nature in this way was really somewhat of a natural progression. And it's interesting to think, too, that this idea for outdoor works had been stirring for quite a while. According to Peggy's memoirs, his sister, Calder's sister Peggy, wrote a memoir, and she writes about heated family discussions a year before, in August of 1933, when they were looking for a house in the country, and that their father was bothered by the use of motors, which would be difficult to arrange outdoors. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Calder's father is Alexander Calder, the famous sculptor who he made such well-known works as Swan Memorial Fountain in Philadelphia, and also George Washington as a statesman on the arch in Washington Square Park. So naturally he had a genuine interest in what his son was doing. And when Calder finished these works, he was extremely excited about them. He wrote to his friend James Johnson Sweeney, who became a huge proponent of his work. He wrote to them in August of 1934, talking about how good he thought they were and that he was ready to show them, and he did. He showed them in September of 1934 in a show. And his father, actually, after that show closed, took them and put them on his own lawn, so he was obviously proud in some way, interested in the works. And here's Calder again with Steelfish. So for this work, Calder, for Steelfish, he made this diagram. So he would eventually dispense with this practice of diagramming as he became more experienced in making mobiles. But I just wanted to show you to give you an idea of how carefully he considered the arrangements of all the works. This is just a great photo of Calder. This is the watershed moment. This is his property in summer of '34. Very proud of his new land. Some people. So these outdoor works were immediately desirable. In 1935, Calder received his first significant commission in Connecticut. It came from James Thrall-Sobey, who I mentioned earlier at the time. He was an advisor at the Wadsworth at that time. And he had bought a Greek Revival house in Farmington, Connecticut. And he was renovating the house with his architect friend Henry Russell Hitchcock, and they commissioned Calder to design a wellhead, a well sweep, for the property. And at 22 feet high and 15 feet in diameter, certainly marked a new development in scale. It has similar tripod legs to the earlier works, the first two that I showed you. And the circular form would raise and lower the bucket, which is hard to see here, but it's here, into the well. And apparently the bucket was inspired by elbow pieces on suits of armor. It didn't work very well, but as Sobey said, The real point was that the mobile was gay and hypnotic to watch as the outdoor breeze set it in motion. And Calder actually had this done, or he employed somebody from the Fuller Welding Company in downtown Hartford to help make the piece under his direction. So Sobey took a number of wonderful photographs from this moment in Farmington, and I'd just like to share a couple of them with you. This is Calder with Eugene Berman, the painter. He was commissioned to make large decorative panels for the Sobey house. And you can see the well sweep as well. And here's Calder, Sobey, and Berman. Again, the well sweep is in the background. There's Calder in Sobey's living room. He's wearing a headdress that he made spontaneously from old-fashioned electrical wire. And you see this great, I love the paintings in the background. And finally, this is his wife Louisa, Calder's wife Louisa, outside of the Farmington house. You can see the well sweep reflected in the windows. And she's playing an accordion. Yeah, what you can't see here is that there's others dancing around here. Chick Austin, Sobey, Eleanor Howland, and other people. This is around what Calder called the winter of accordion music. He had bought her a toy accordion, and she played it so well, he progressively bought her another one, and then another one. I think this might be the second one, but she would play her accordion often. They had their own legendary parties at the house in Roxbury, and there's many photos where you can see her playing her accordion and lots of dancing. And finally, Sobey took many photos of Calder's in his ice house studio. This is one of them from 1936. And I love this photo because as you can get a sense here, Calder at work in his studio was really the antithesis of playful frivolity, as you can see here. He really worked there from 8 to 5 like a businessman, very serious about it. He preferred to work alone even when he was extremely popular. And despite the seriousness, though, it's wonderful because there's no forced urgency to his work. To do it well really meant to work from insight and intellect and to let the process unfold intuitively. So after the Sobey Commission, Calder experimented with different configurations in the outdoors. This work is called 9 Discs. Calder kept this work for himself. It's a 15-foot-high mobile hung on a post that terminated into the ground. You can see steel fish in the distance here and an apple tree in the foreground. And at the time they bought the house, there were really only 2 trees. There was an old split apple tree that they patched up, and they would often have lunch and dinners in the spring and summertime under the tree. And there was a maple by the driveway. But after many years, the fields went to seed and the apple trees grew abundantly. So by 1936, as Calder's works became increasingly larger, he realized it was costly and time-consuming to make mistakes in the large scale. So he devised a new process of sketching in metal. He would make small maquettes or models, and from them he would enlarge his sculptures. This work is called Devilfish. It's the first work made from a maquette. And it's about 5.5 feet tall, and it's made from a 35-inch maquette. And beginning in the 1960s, Calder would make increasingly larger maquettes for his more gigantic works, and actually the mountains work at the Minor Library. I'll talk about that in a bit, but that's an intermediate maquette. And they were used for wind tunnel testing and so forth. And this process was based in large part on the classical enlargement techniques that his father and his grandfather used. I mentioned his father earlier, but his grandfather was Alexander Calder, who made the large William Penn atop Philadelphia City Hall. So Calder once said he wasn't brought up, he was framed, and like he grew up in this artistic family with these great ideas generating. His mother was also a painter. This is Big Bird, 7 feet high. This is the second work made from a maquette. And both of these works were included in a 1937 exhibition at the Pierre Matisse Gallery. And as you can see here underneath Big Bird, there's all of these little maquettes right here. And the idea was for viewers to come and patrons to come, see the maquettes, and then commission Calder to make a large-scale work for their garden. And I believe Catherine Dreyer, the arts patron, bought the maquette for Big Bird. It's now at, I think it's now at Yale. And finally, in 1940, Calder made Black Beast. It's shown here at the Matisse Gallery in 1940. Calder later referred to this work as the forerunner of the big stabiles to come. It's 8.5 feet by 13.5 feet wide, so it was really his most industrious undertaking at that time. And later in '57, he made a second version of this in heavier materials for the courtyard of the architect Elliot Noyes in New Canaan. So I'd just like to shift gears for a moment. And before we get to the really huge works, I'd just like to show some historical photos of the Roxbury property and breathe some life into it. So from all accounts that I've read, Calder and his family lived a very simple, honest, and direct life on the land, very grounded in humanity and simplicity of means. Everything was handmade, from the furniture, appliances, and the utensils, and then Louisa also made rugs, and she made all of the children's clothing. This photo was taken in 1938. It's a photo by Herbert Matter, who I should have mentioned earlier, actually. Matter is a really important, he's a Swiss graphic designer, and he took one of the most important photographic records of Calder's life and work. And we actually did a book a couple of years ago that publishes a lot of these photographs from our archives. They're really wonderful. Here in 1938, Calder's dancing with his 3-year-old daughter, Sandra. And you can see Louisa playing her accordion. And in the next year, in '39, their second daughter, Mary, would be born. Here's Calder with his goats. And the idea of the goats was to keep the fields mowed, apparently. They had cows. It didn't work very well. So as his artworks increased in size and volume, the Ice House studio that I showed you earlier became jam-packed. So in October of 1938, Calder began construction of a studio on the foundations of a burned-out dairy barn on the property. And the studio was designed entirely to his specifications, very much in service of the open air. And a large part of the facade was made for enormous steel factory windows, and Calder would often leave these open. You can actually see Calder in this photo. I think that's him. So the studio was finished in spring of 1939. Here's Calder in the studio in 1941. You can see the doors are open. You can see cows in the background. Hanging above Calder is one of the largest hanging mobiles created at that point, about 10 by 10 feet. It was also the very first so-called light-reflecting mobile. He went on to create about 3 dozen more of these, and they're really miraculous works that Calder would leave unpainted intentionally so that they could capture the surrounding light and reflect it. And they really create this beautiful experience of projected light and shadow. And for his hotel, Avila Ballroom in Caracas. And Calder did several projects with those. And here's another interior shot. You can see the maquette for Black Beast, which I showed you earlier. Here's the maquette. And there are a few works I'd like to point out that are sort of organically inspired by the landscape. On the upper right here, or upper left, is this wooden work. This is called Apple Monster. Calder had taken a fallen branch from an apple tree, turned it upside down, and painted it. And this is what the work looks like. It's about 5.5 feet tall. And then also down here, you'll see a little knobby piece of wood here. This is a tuber from a myrtle tree that Calder took unaltered, and then he stuck these flags in it that he painted multiple colors. And it was called Myrtle Burl. And I have a photograph of that right here. So that's Myrtle Burl. And here's another interior studio shot. Calder had installed about 150 screw eyes in the rafters so he could hoist his mobiles up there and get them out of the way. And he would leave the windows open so they would stir and create this wonderful noise. And in the upper right of this frame, you can see part of the gong mobile. Calder created about 4 dozen sound-producing works in his career, and this was one of the earliest gong mobiles, and so it was a particularly noisy one in the studio. And in the center, there's a series of standing mobiles. You can see it most prominently, this one with these cascading aluminum elements. That's called Aluminum Leaves Red Post, the Whitney, and that's the work. And here's another with Calder on his land with a work called Giraffe, which was also in that photo from 1941. So aluminum leaves, along with some of the other works I just showed you, some of those were included in his 1941 show at the Pierre Matisse Gallery in New York. And for these shows, he would pack his LaSalle with artworks and drive them into the city, which is what he's doing here. And he kept this LaSalle for 17 years. This is the same one that he bought in July of 1933, and apparently it underwent a number of interesting transformations. The top had cotton fire along with the upholstery, so he had created these iron rods that he put across, and he just threw a tarp over it as they drove into the city. And instead of knobs on the dashboard, there were a lot of protruding pieces of wire. Arthur Miller writes a really interesting description of the car, actually. Here's Calder next to a swimming hole in the soft corner of his land in 1938. He's handling a sailboat that he made from a large sheet of aluminum, and during the war, when sheet metal was in short supply, he became increasingly innovative with his use of everyday materials, and he used this boat as well to make his mobiles. Here's an example of one of those works. This is Red Petals from 1942. It was commissioned from the Arts Club of Chicago. It's also one of the few large-scale works that Calder made during the war due to this limitation of sheet metal. The mobile leaves of this work were made from repurposed aluminum, likely from the sailboat that we just saw. And the base of the work was made from the big chunk of an old boiler that Calder had bought at an old junkyard. And he cut out a big leaf shape from it and turned it on end. And it's about 8 feet tall. So a large number of surrealists found safe haven in Litchfield County during the war as well. Among them were Arshil Gorky in Sherman, Andre Masson in New Preston, Hans Richter in Southbury, and Yves Tanguy and K-Sage in Woodbury. And Calder had early close associations with the surrealists. He had been showing with them since as early as 1936, so naturally they looked to him for a community during the war. This is a great photo from 1941 in Roxbury. Standing to the left is Andre Masson, and Calder was actually really instrumental in helping him find a place in New Preston. Next to Masson is Beatrice Prescott and then Calder. And then sitting to the far left is Andre Breton, who is known as the founding father of surrealism. Next to him is Susanna Perkins Hare, who is the wife of David Hare, the surrealist sculptor who also lived in Roxbury. And then we have Louisa Calder, Rose Masson, Charlie Prescott, you see Mary Calder, and Teenie Matisse, who was the wife of Pierre Matisse at the time. On the left is a photo of Calder setting up the circus in his studio with Yves Tanguy in 1941. And he performed the circus, his Cirque Calder, many times in Roxbury, on the lawn and the studio. He also performed it in Bridgewater once with Saul Steinberg and Jean Davidson. And you can see Mary and then Sandra looking on. You can see, I guess it's a little bit of Mary to the far left. They're looking on in amazement, and it's wonderful because even up till today, when I asked Sandra about the circus, her eyes light up with this, wonder, and she describes how wonderful it was that Calder would, take the LaSalle, go to Waterbury, get these huge planks and bring them back, and they'd get circus peanuts, and it was the whole 9 yards. And Calder saw quite a bit of the Tanguys as well. And to the image on the right is also in Roxbury. This close-up Louis Cert, Fernand Léger, and Andre Masson. And Cert commissioned Calder to make the Mercury Fountain in 1937 for his Spanish pavilion at the Paris World's Fair. So Calder had a very close friendship with him over the years, and he visited Roxbury quite a bit. So after the war, beginning in the 1950s, Calder focused more and more on monumental sculptures and commissions. And as these works grew, Calder devised special braces, ribs, and gussets to help support and reinforce these large works. And he was intimately involved in all phases of the fabrication of these works, even the details of a sculpture's bolt holes. He was originally trained as an engineer, so these sort of things were really interesting for him. 1957 was a particularly prolific year. He had several commissions that year. There's one for UNESCO in Paris, one for the Port Authority of New York, and one for the Brussels World's Fair. And so he used 3 separate foundries in Litchfield County, 2 in Waterbury and 1 in Watertown for that year. And this photo, Calder's at Segres Ironworks with the commission for UNESCO. He hammered and welded the top at Segres, and he employed the French engineer Jean Prouvé to make the base in France to spare transportation costs. And here's the finished work, La Spirale, in 1958. It's about 30 feet high. Here's Calder at Waterbury Ironworks in '57. He's working on the commission for the Port Authority of New York, specifically for their International Arrivals building at Idlewild, which is now known as JFK. And Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill had designed the building. And Calder made 3 models to scale, 17 inches wide, and the one they blew up was enlarged to 45 feet wide. Here he is assisting. Again, he was really involved with all phases of, it's really an extension of himself, these fabrications. And here he is with the finished work called .125, which indicated the gauge of the aluminum elements. This work can now be found in Terminal 4. And finally, here's Calder with the maquette for the Brussels World's Fair and Roxbury in '57. Well, the photo was taken in Roxbury in '57. It was designed for Edward Durrell Stone's U.S. Pavilion, and the fabrication took place in Watertown, and the monumental work was completed in January of '58. And here's a photograph of it. You'll notice it's in an oval pool, and Calder loved working with water. He began to devise what he called water ballets with fountains as early as 1939. So 30 years after first moving here, Calder continued to place his works on the grounds of his Roxbury property, which is where he is here, and he'd enjoy them outside. And he'd also place them on the grounds to tempt potential purchasers. But behind him in this photo is Southern Cross. This was the only monumental work that Calder designed to keep for himself, while others were installed with wooden blocks. This had concrete footings. And actually around this time, these works began to emerge all over Connecticut on the properties of his friend, the Littmans, who lived in Cannondale, also Marcel Breuer's house in New Canaan, Elliot Noyes' house in New Canaan, which I mentioned earlier, and others. This work is about 20 feet high, and here it is in color. So this work was named after the celestial constellation Southern Cross. And as you can see, there's sort of an element of the work that suggests that title. And this was how Calder often devised titles for his works. He would pick the title after the work was created, after a vague description of the form of the work. So titles aren't really meant to be assets for interpretation, but rather they're sort of created after the fact, based on what strikes him about the work. He once went so far as to call them license plates, so they're meant primarily for identification purposes as well. Here's Segres in 1970. You can see it's something of an open-air museum at the time. Calder called these monumental works his dreadnought variety, so it's interesting that early in the 30s he referred to his works as sailing vessels, and in the 60s he then called them the dreadnoughts. This might somehow relate. Calder did have some experience in sailing. He took odd jobs in the 1920s on vessels as he crossed the Atlantic. So from left to right, we have Hats Off. That really large sculpture on the left is at PepsiCo in Purchase, New York. And then Brontosaurus, which is now on view in Dublin, I think. There's the lightning, and then the black work is the kite that never flew, which is at Princeton. And then we have the Clove and the Snook. All of these works date between 67 and 70. Here's Flamingo from 1973. This was fabricated at Segres, and it's installed at the Federal Center Plaza in Chicago. It's designed by Mies van der Rohe. The buildings around it are designed by Mies van der Rohe. It's a really beautiful sculpture. Calder of this work said it must be designed as a real urban signal as well as sculpture. So it's interesting that he envisioned these sculptures as statements in a new language of urban design in a way, and they really enliven the architecture of his contemporaries. And finally, in 1976, and the last year of Calder's life, he was working on a number of important commissions all over the world for monumental works, from Israel and France to the Netherlands, Denmark, and the States. This is Mountains and Clouds. It's located in the atrium of the Hart Senate Building in DC, and it can really be qualified as the last monumental project of his career, as he was in DC working on the final arrangements of this work the day before he died. He died on November 11th. And one of the many unique factors of this work is that it combines a separate mobile, and a stable, so as opposed to a standing mobile. The total weight of the clouds, according to their archives is 4,300 pounds. The largest cloud is over 43 feet long, so this is an enormous sculpture. The stabile is 51 feet high. And that brings us to Mountains at the Minor. This work is the intermediate maquette for the monumental stabile we just saw in DC. So it was designed with the idea in mind that it would become a 51-foot high stabile used for structural tests, etc. There's also a smaller maquette that was used or given to the architects to consider the proposal in the first place, and also for fabrication purposes. And one of the really wonderful things about this work is it has these combination of arching forms that sort of grow organically out of the ground with these really steep planes that slice through space without really filling it up. And then it has this wonderful negative space in the center that really reinforces this continuity of experience between aesthetics and nature. And in the words of Arthur Miller, who was Calder's Roxbury neighbor, it is from these spaces, the silences in his work, that life springs out at us. And with that, I'd like to invite everybody to join us to go over and see the work at the Minor. We are going to walk over or drive, whatever you're comfortable with, and yeah, that about wraps it up. So.